In 2000, I'd been working as a park ranger in Wrangell-St. Elias National Park, Alaska, for about 8 years. It wasn't a glamorous job, but I liked it because no one bothered me out here. No traffic jams, no emails flooding my inbox, and no office small talk about the weather. I was in charge of patrolling some of the most remote parts of the park, places so isolated that if you found yourself lost, you'd wish you had at least brought along someone who could dig a decent grave. My name's Jason Shaw. I was raised in Tennessee, nowhere fancy, just a regular town where people got up early, worked all day, and went home to eat microwave dinners. I never really had much of a family. My mom died when I was a kid, and my dad was one of those men who thought hugs and words of encouragement were for soft people. So I grew up tough, but not by choice. Maybe that's why I ended up out here, because being surrounded by trees and mountains felt less complicated than being around other people. Plus, Alaska's wildlife was the only company that didn't make me want to punch something. That day, I was heading out to check an old ranger cabin deep in the forest. It was part of my routine, a hike that took me nearly 3 hours each way. These cabins weren't used much anymore, but we kept them stocked and ready just in case some hikers got lost or a blizzard hit unexpectedly. I'd heard some local chatter about strange sightings out this way, but honestly, Alaska is filled with weird stuff. People come up here, get lost in their own heads, and start thinking the moose are watching them, or that the northern lights are spelling out secret messages. You get used to it. I wasn't expecting any real trouble, just a long hike and maybe some scattered snowfall by dusk. The forest was dense, the kind of place where even your own footsteps sound foreign after a while. There was this cold silence out there that made you feel like the trees were holding their breath. It's a feeling that gnaws at you, like you're not alone, even though you are. By the time I reached the cabin, I was regretting not bringing a flask. The place looked about as welcoming as an abandoned crypt, half buried in snow, with its wooden door hanging crooked like someone had been in a hurry to get out. The windows were frosted over, but I could see the faint shapes of the furniture inside, untouched and still. The air around it felt heavier, like the trees themselves were leaning in, curious. As I stepped inside, I noticed the firewood pile had been knocked over, and the faint smell of something I couldn't place lingered in the air, like damp fur or something else. Something metallic, maybe. Some hikers had probably stayed the night and left in a rush. It wasn't unusual, especially if they'd spotted a bear or one of Alaska's more intimidating residents. I was about to radio in when I saw it. Blood. Not a lot, just a few droplets, but it was fresh, stark against the dirty wooden floor. My mind immediately went to the usual suspects, injured wildlife, maybe even a hunter who got too close to his own game. But something didn't sit right with me about the scene. It wasn't the amount of blood, it was the placement, the way the drops seemed to form a trail leading deeper into the woods. Great, I thought. Another lost hiker, probably spooked by a wolf or a wolverine. I grabbed my flashlight and started following the blood trail, but so every instinct in me telling me this was a bad idea. But hey, I wasn't going to leave someone out there to freeze or bleed out. Alaskan winters don't care how tough you think you are. They'll take you out without a second thought. The trail led deeper into the woods, winding between thick pines and jagged rocks. That's when I began to notice the tracks. They were odd, partially human but distorted. It looked like whoever had made them had been dragging something, or limping. No, more like staggering. And there were claw marks too, long and uneven, like something with large talons had swiped at the ground. My stomach dropped as I crouched down to get a closer look. I'm no stranger to strange prints, but these were something else. The size was wrong. Too big for a wolf and too narrow for a bear. I stood up, my breath hanging in the cold air, and suddenly I felt it. That deep, gut-wrenching realization that whatever made these tracks wasn't something I could explain with the usual suspects. I kept moving, slowly now, my senses on high alert. The woods around me felt wrong. The air was still, no sound of birds, no crunch of snow underfoot from wildlife. Just silence. I'd heard people talk about how quiet things get when predators are around, but this felt different, like the forest itself was waiting. Then I saw it. Or rather, I saw them. 3 bodies, half buried in snow, just past a small clearing. They were fresh. Too fresh. I could tell by the way the blood was still soaking into the snow. All three were missing limbs, their faces contorted in terror, eyes wide open, like they'd seen something worse than death itself. One of them looked like a hunter. He had on the kind of gear you'd expect from someone experienced out here. But experience didn't help him. My heart was pounding now. Not out of fear, out of sheer adrenaline. I took a step forward, and that's when I heard it. The sound of something heavy, something large, moving through the trees behind me. I didn't turn around immediately, mostly because I figured I'd regret it if I did. When I finally did look, I wished I hadn't. It stood maybe 20 yards away, partially hidden by the trees. Tall, easily over 8 feet, with hunched shoulders and thick, matted fur. Its limbs were long, too long, like a grizzly bear that had spent too much time in a blender. But the head was the worst part, elongated, almost canine, but twisted, like nature had tried to make a wolf and then gave up halfway through. Its mouth hung open, drooling, exposing a row of jagged teeth that looked more like broken glass than anything natural. And then it moved. Not quickly, but with purpose, lumbering through the snow like it didn't care that I was standing there, armed with nothing more than a radio and a flashlight. I wasn't a hero. I didn't try to take it on. Instead, I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on it as it stalked toward me. My mind raced with every bad decision I'd ever made, and for a split second, I wondered if this was just a bad hallucination. Maybe I'd wandered into some leftover military testing zone and was about to become a statistic. But the smell, God, that smell. It hit me like a punch to the face. Decay, rot, and something else. Something unnatural, like sulfur mixed with blood. My legs finally kicked into gear, and I turned, running like hell through the woods, not caring which direction I was heading. The creature didn't make a sound as it followed, just the dull thud of its massive body moving through the snow. My lungs burned. My heart felt like it was going to explode, but I kept running, fueled by the very real possibility that if I stopped, I'd end up like those bodies in the clearing. I don't know how far I ran, but I eventually lost it. At least, I thought I did. The forest around me was pitch black now, and my flashlight was starting to flicker. The radio crackled uselessly in my hand. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, trying to make sense of what the hell had just happened. And that's when I heard the scream. Close. Maybe 100 yards away. At first, I thought it was human. It wasn't. It was something trying to sound human, like a poor imitation. I don't know what came over me, but I started moving again, this time more cautiously. The scream came again, closer this time, and then I saw the source, another body. But this one was different. It was alive, barely. A woman, or at least what was left of her, was crawling through the snow. Her legs had been torn to shreds, and she was dragging herself forward, leaving a trail of blood behind her. I crouched down beside her, ready to help, but as soon as I touched her, I knew it was too late. She looked at me, her eyes wild with pain and fear, and then she whispered something I'll never forget. "It's not from here." Before I could ask her what she meant, she let out a final ragged breath and went still. I stood up, scanning the trees, my pulse hammering in my ears. Whatever had done this wasn't far. I needed to get out of here, fast. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something shiny poking out of the snow beside the woman's body. A camera, a small, handheld one. It looked like it had seen better days, but it was intact. I grabbed it, tucking it into my jacket pocket, and took off again, my mind racing with questions. Back at the ranger station, I didn't say a word to anyone. I just locked myself in the office, pulled out the camera, and hit play. The footage was shaky, the kind you'd expect from someone running for their life. It showed the forest, the snow, the trees blurring by as the person holding the camera sprinted. And then for a split second, there it was. The creature. Its massive form loomed in the background, moving too quickly for something that size. And then the screen went black. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what I'd just seen. Eventually, I knew I had to do something. The next morning, I handed the camera to my supervisor without saying much. "You're not going to believe this," I said. He watched it, his face going pale. After a few minutes, he turned it off and looked at me. "Let's keep this between us for now," he said. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because, deep down, I knew that whatever it wasn't something anyone else needed to know about. Alaska had its secrets, and I had just stumbled upon one I wished I hadn't. The next day, the cabin was burned down by accident. Let's just say I got a promotion after that. And they finally put a flask in my ranger kit. Not that I needed one. I quit drinking after that night. No use trying to forget what you can't explain. My name is Gabriel Allen, and back in 2021, I had an unforgettable experience in the remote reaches of Denali National Park, Alaska. As an ecologist with a penchant for adventure, I thought spending a summer studying alpine flora would be both fulfilling and, dare I say, a walk in the park, literally. I had always been fascinated by the rugged beauty of Alaska. The towering peaks, the sweeping glaciers, and the untouched wilderness called to me like a siren song. When the opportunity arose to join a small research team studying plant life above the tree line, I jumped at the chance faster than a cheetah on energy drinks. Our team consisted of 4 members. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a seasoned botanist with a sharp wit. Alex Kim, a graduate student who could find humor in the driest of lands. Sarah Oli, a wildlife photographer whose lens captured more than just images. And me, the guy who thought bear spray was an acceptable substitute for cologne. We set up our base camp miles away from any semblance of civilization. The idea was to immerse ourselves completely, to live and breathe the environment we were studying, or, as Alex put it, to become one with the moss. The first few days were idyllic. We cataloged rare plants, marveled at the expanse of landscapes, and even had a friendly competition to see who could make the best dehydrated meal. Spoiler alert, they all tasted like cardboard, but at least mine had a hint of oregano. One evening, as we sat around the campfire swapping stories, Sarah mentioned she'd spotted unusual tracks earlier that day. They were huge, like if a grizzly decided to moonlight as Bigfoot, she joked. We all chuckled, but Dr. Vasquez seemed intrigued. Maybe it's a new species, she mused. Alex raised an eyebrow. Yeah, and maybe the squirrels are plotting to steal our trail mix. The next morning, curiosity got the better of us. We decided to follow the tracks, partly out of scientific interest and partly because, well, who doesn't love a good mystery? The footprints led us deeper into the wilderness, an area not marked on any of our maps. The further we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees stood taller, their branches intertwining like the fingers of giants. It was as if we had stepped into another world, one where we were decidedly unwelcome. Anyone else getting the feeling we're being watched? I quipped, trying to lighten the mood. Sarah nodded, her camera clicking away. If we are, I hope it's my good side. We stumbled upon a clearing where the tracks abruptly ended. In the center stood the massive carcass of a moose, or at least what was left of it. The body was torn apart, limbs scattered, and the ground soaked with blood. It was a gruesome sight, enough to make a butcher turn vegan. Dr. Vasquez approached cautiously, her professional demeanor masking any revulsion. These injuries aren't consistent with any known predator in the area, she observed. Unless the wolves have started using chainsaws, Alex muttered under his breath. As we examined the scene, a foul stench filled the air, a mix of decay and something indescribably foul. It was so thick you could practically spread it on toast. Not that you'd want to. Suddenly, a rustling noise echoed from the tree line. We all froze. Probably just the wind, I offered, though the quiver in my voice betrayed me. The rustling grew louder, more deliberate. Whatever was making that sound was big, and it was getting closer. Maybe we should head back, Sarah suggested, her eyes darting around nervously. Dr. Vasquez nodded. Agreed. We've seen enough for today. We retraced our steps, but the forest seemed different now, darker, more oppressive. The path we had taken had somehow vanished, and the GPS was nothing more than a glorified paperweight without signal. Fantastic, Alex grumbled. Lost in the Alaskan wilderness with a mystery creature, just what I signed up for. As we pressed on, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. I tried to crack a joke, something about us starring in our own reality show, Survivor Denali Edition, but it fell flat. Out of nowhere, a deafening howl shattered the silence. It wasn't like anything we'd ever heard, a deep, primal sound that reverberated through the trees. What in the world was that? Sarah exclaimed, gripping her camera like a lifeline. Before anyone could answer, a massive figure burst through the underbrush. It moved on all fours, but its gait was all wrong. Too fluid, too calculated. Covered in coarse fur, it was like a wolf stretched to unnatural proportions, muscles rippling under its matted coat. "Run!" Dr. Vasquez shouted, snapping us out of our stupor. We bolted, adrenaline fueling our sprint through the dense forest. Behind us, the creature gave chase, its heavy footfalls echoing like a drumbeat. Alex was the first to falter. He tripped over an exposed root and went down hard. I skidded to a halt, torn between survival instinct and the need to help my friend. Without thinking, I doubled back, grabbing his arm. "Come on, buddy. This isn't the time for a nap." We stumbled forward, but it was too late. The creature was upon us. It swiped at Alex with a clawed hand. No, more like a paw with elongated fingers tipped with razor-sharp claws. The impact sent him crashing into a tree trunk, his body slumping to the ground. "Alex!" I screamed, but there was no response. Blood pooled beneath him, a stark contrast against the mossy earth. Dr. Vasquez pulled me back. "We have to keep moving," she urged, her eyes wide with fear yet steely with determination. Sarah was ahead of us, frantically searching for any recognizable landmark. We broke through the tree line into another clearing, this one with a sheer drop on the other side, a cliff overlooking a rocky ravine. "Dead end," Sarah whispered, panic creeping into her voice. The creature emerged from the forest, blocking our only escape route. It stood upright now, towering over us. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and animal features, with a snout like a wolf and eyes that gleamed with a predatory intelligence. "Any brilliant ideas?" I asked, my attempt at humor falling flat. Dr. Vasquez glanced at the flare gun attached to her belt. "It's not much, but it's something." She aimed and fired. The flare hit the creature square in the chest, igniting its fur. It let out a screech, a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down my spine. Taking advantage of its momentary distraction, we skirted around it, making a break for the forest. We didn't stop until we reached our camp, collapsing near the tents. "We have to call for help," Dr. Vasquez said between gasps, reaching for the satellite phone. Her hands were shaking. "No signal," she muttered, slamming it down. "Figures," I sighed. "We finally need technology, and it's as useful as a chocolate teapot." A deep snarl emanated from the shadows beyond our campfire's glow. "It's here," Sarah whispered, eyes wide. The creature lunged from the darkness. Targeting Dr. Vasquez, before we could react, it slashed at her, and she fell lifeless to the ground, blood spattering across the tent canvas, a horrifying painting of our grim reality. Acting on pure instinct, I grabbed the nearest object, a cast-iron skillet from our cooking gear. "Time to fry this overgrown mutt," I muttered. Sarah and I positioned ourselves on opposite sides, trying to confuse it. "Hey, ugly, over here!" I shouted, waving my makeshift weapon. The creature turned its gaze toward me, snarling. Sarah took the opportunity to grab a flare from Dr. Vasquez's fallen gear. She ignited it, the bright light causing the creature to recoil. "Now!" she yelled. Seizing the moment, I swung the skillet with all my might, connecting with the creature's jaw. It stumbled backward. More surprised than hurt. "Guess you're not a fan of home cooking," I quipped. But our victory was short-lived. The creature regained its footing, its eyes now filled with rage. It charged at me, and I braced for impact. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air. The creature stopped mid-stride, a tranquilizer dart protruding from its neck. From the trees emerged a group of people dressed in tactical gear. "Stand down!" one of them shouted. The creature swayed before collapsing to the ground. "Who are you?" I demanded, both relieved and baffled. The apparent leader approached. "Federal Wildlife Control," he stated curtly. "You're lucky we got here when we did." "Lucky's one word for it," Sarah muttered. They secured the creature with heavy chains, hauling it onto a reinforced vehicle. "What is that thing?" I asked. The man glared at me. "Classified," he replied. "But let's just say it's a genetic anomaly we've been tracking." "Classified? 2 of our team members are dead," I shouted, anger boiling over. He paused. "I'm sorry for your loss, but this area was supposed to be off limits. Didn't you receive the notices?" We exchanged glances. "No, we were given full clearance for our research. Dr. Vasquez handled all the permits." Something wasn't adding up. They escorted us back to civilization, but warned us to keep silent about the incident. "For your safety and others," their leader emphasized. Back home, I couldn't let it go. I started digging, using every connection and resource available. What I found was both astounding and disturbing. Deep in the archives of government experiments, I uncovered references to a project aimed at creating super soldiers by combining human and animal DNA. Cliché, perhaps, but the evidence was there. Reports of test subjects escaping into the wild, cover-ups of civilian deaths, and areas quietly quarantined under the guise of wildlife preservation. The creature we encountered wasn't a mythical beast or an undiscovered species. It was a man-made abomination, a testament to humanity's hubris. In the end, the truth was more terrifying than any monster. My name is Kevin Scott. I'm 31 years old, and I swear to God, everything I'm about to tell you is real. It happened 2 years ago in the middle of Green Swamp Wilderness Preserve, Florida. I wish I had listened to the warning. It started as a weekend trip, just 4 of us. Me, my old Army buddy Travis, my best friend Ryan, and his girlfriend Jessie. Ryan was obsessed with urban legends, always chasing cryptid stories and internet horror nonsense. He had been talking for weeks about La Bruja, a swamp witch that supposedly haunted the backwoods of Florida, stealing souls and driving people insane. I should have told him to shut up and pick a normal vacation spot. We set off in Travis's beat-up RV, a clunky relic that rattled like a tin can every time we hit a pothole. The trip was supposed to be fun. Campfires, fishing, and beers under the stars. Just some time away from the city. Instead, it became the worst night of my life. The first sign of trouble came before we even got there. At a gas station just outside the swamp, an old man sitting on the porch stared at us like we were already dead. He spat into a tin cup and said, "Y'all ain't got no business out there." Ryan, grinning like an idiot, asked if he believed in the stories. The old man's face darkened. Once you hear the singing, it's already too late. Travis laughed it off. Jessie rolled her eyes. I felt something tighten in my chest. We drove into the wilderness, deeper than I liked. No cell signal, no GPS. After a while, just miles of swamp, trees like skeletal hands reaching toward the sky. It was nearly sunset when we finally parked the RV in a clearing by the water. The first thing I noticed? The silence. No birds, no bugs, not even the hum of mosquitoes. Just dead air, thick with humidity and something I couldn't name. We set up a fire, cooked some canned chili, and cracked open a few beers. The tension eased. Even I started to relax. Then, just after midnight, Ryan disappeared. I woke up to Jessie shaking me. "Kevin, Scott's gone." The fire was just smoldering embers, casting long shadows on the trees. Travis sat up, groggy, rubbing his face. We found Ryan's boots and clothes neatly folded on a log near the water. His camera was still there, turned off. No tracks leading away. No sound. Jessie panicked. "We need to look for him, now." "Hell no," I said. "We wait until morning. We don't go into the swamp at night." But she wasn't listening. She grabbed a flashlight and stormed off. Travis and I had no choice but to follow. The deeper we went, the more wrong everything felt. The trees started to look the same, like we were walking in circles. My watch said 2:14 a.m., but the moon hadn't moved. Then we heard it, a woman humming, soft, eerie, like an old lullaby. Travis froze. "That ain't Jessie." The light from Jessie's flashlight flickered in the distance. She screamed. We ran toward her, found her standing in a knee-deep pool of water, shaking. I saw him. "Ryan?" She nodded. "He was standing right there. But his eyes were black, pitch black. He smiled at me." I turned my flashlight on the water. Nothing, just ripples. Travis grabbed my arm. "Kevin," I turned. A woman was standing in the trees. She was impossibly tall, skin stretched tight over her bones. Her face was wrong, her mouth too wide, her fingers too long, and her eyes, black pits. Empty. She smiled. The flashlight died. Something yanked Travis into the water. He screamed, thrashing as unseen hands pulled him under. I lunged, grabbed his arm. Jessie screamed beside me. I pulled hard. Something let go. Travis gasped, coughing up swamp water, but his back was covered in deep claw marks, bleeding through his shirt. We ran. Somehow, we made it back to the RV. We barricaded ourselves inside, locked the doors, closed the curtains. Jessie sobbed. Travis groaned in pain. I checked the gashes on his back. They weren't just wounds. They were symbols. Then Ryan knocked on the door. Jessie moved to unlock it, but I grabbed her wrist. "Look at his eyes," I whispered. Through the window, I saw him standing in the moonlight, smiling. Too wide, his black eyes gleaming. "Let me in, guys," he said. His voice layered. His and something else. Jessie broke. "It's him. We have to let him in." Travis, still weak, just muttered, Don't. I grabbed my knife. Ryan kept knocking, louder, then pounding. I stepped forward, gripping the handle, my heart slamming in my chest. Then Ryan stopped. Silence. I peeked out the window. Gone. We didn't sleep. Every few minutes I swore I heard whispering outside, soft laughter, scratching on the walls. Around dawn, Jessie had had enough. She grabbed a backpack. I'm going for help. I grabbed her arm. No, you're not. She shook me off. I can't stay in here, Kevin. I can't. She ran outside before I could stop her. She screamed. I bolted after her. Nothing. Just her flashlight on the ground. She was gone. Vanished. Travis and I sat there in stunned silence. I wanted to cry, to scream, but I couldn't. Then Ryan came back. He walked right out of the trees, smiling, naked except for his jeans. His eyes, normal again, his voice, his own. What's wrong? He asked. You guys look like you've seen a ghost. Travis whispered, No. I clenched my knife. Where's Jessie? Ryan tilted his head. Who's Jessie? My stomach dropped. Travis lost it. He grabbed a tire iron and swung at Ryan, but Ryan moved too fast, too fluid. He caught the iron mid-swing. Smiled. Don't do that, buddy. I grabbed Travis and dragged him back toward the RV. We locked the door, boarded up the windows with what little we had left. Ryan sat outside, just sat there, smiling, and night fell again. Travis stopped responding. He was burning up, feverish, and then the humming started again. Ryan started laughing. I heard Jessie's voice whisper through the walls. Kevin, let me in. I closed my eyes, held my breath. At some point, Travis stopped breathing. Morning came. Ryan was gone. Travis was cold. I didn't wait any longer. I ran through the swamp, not stopping, not caring what was behind me. I ran until I saw a road. A trucker found me, half crazed, covered in mud and blood. They never found Travis's body, or Jessie's. They did find the RV, though. The doors ripped off. The inside, covered in deep claw marks. And Ryan? He was on the news a week later, found wandering near the swamp. No memory of what happened. He doesn't remember me. But sometimes I wake up at night and I hear the humming. My name is Timothy Perez, and in 2015, I ventured to Isle Royale in Michigan to escape the bustle of city life. I'd always been the kind of guy who preferred the whisper of the trees over the honking of horns, and this remote island seemed like the perfect getaway. I arrived on a chilly morning, the kind where your breath fogs up like a bad magic trick. The ferry ride over Lake Superior was uneventful, save for an older gentleman who warned me about the island's unpredictable weather. If you don't like it, he chuckled, just wait 6 minutes. I laughed it off, thinking I'd heard that joke in every town I'd ever visited. Isle Royale was everything I hoped it would be. Dense forests, crystal clear lakes, and trails that seemed to stretch on forever. I set up camp near Rock Harbor, not far from where the ferry had dropped me off. The plan was simple. Hike, take photos, and maybe find some inspiration for the novel I'd been pretending to write for years. You know, the one where the hero saves the world and gets the girl, all while maintaining perfect hair. On my second day, I met a group of hikers, Tom, Lisa, and their teenage son, Max. They were from Chicago and had that Midwestern friendliness that makes you feel like you've known them for years. We exchanged pleasantries, and they invited me to join them for dinner at their campsite. Never one to turn down free food, especially when my options were dwindling packets of instant noodles, I gladly accepted. As we sat around the campfire that evening, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories, Tom shared tales about the island's wildlife. They say the wolves here are some of the most elusive creatures you'll never see, he said, poking the fire with a stick. Maybe they're just introverted, I quipped. Can't blame them for wanting some peace and quiet. Max rolled his eyes. Dad thinks every rustle in the bushes is a wolf waiting to pounce. Better safe than sorry, Lisa interjected, smiling warmly. The night sky was a canvas of stars, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Little did I know that would be the last time things felt normal. The next morning, we decided to hike together to Mount Ojibwe, one of the island's higher points, promising breathtaking views. As we trekked through the forest, conversations flowed easily. Max complained about not having cell service. Tom told another one of his infamous dad jokes. Why don't oysters donate to charity? Because they're shellfish. And Lisa kept us all in line with her motherly charm. About halfway up, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned ranger station. It looked like it hadn't seen maintenance since flip phones were cutting-edge technology. Curious, we decided to take a look inside. The door creaked ominously. Classic horror movie stuff, I know. The interior was sparse. A broken chair, a desk with outdated maps, and a musty smell that could have been bottled and sold as ode to neglect. Max found a faded journal tucked in a drawer. Flipping through it, his face paled. "Listen to this," he said. June 5th, 1998, sightings of an unknown animal have increased. Rangers advised to travel in pairs. 2 hikers reported missing. "Probably just old campfire stories," I suggested, trying to lighten the mood. "Or maybe the previous ranger had an overactive imagination." Tom shrugged. "Still, maybe we should stick together. Safety in numbers, right?" We continued our hike, but the atmosphere had shifted. The forest seemed quieter, as if holding its breath. Even the birds had ceased their chatter. I joked that they must be on a union-mandated break, but no one laughed. Reaching the summit, the view was as spectacular as promised. Lake Superior stretched out endlessly, its waters glistening under the midday sun. We ate lunch in relative silence, the earlier unease still lingering. On our way back, we noticed something odd. The forest floor, which had been carpeted with leaves and twigs, now showed signs of disturbance. Deep gashes marred the trees, and patches of ground looked as though they'd been clawed by something large. "Probably a bear," Tom speculated, though his voice lacked conviction. "Do bears even live on this island?" Lisa asked, her eyes wide. "Mostly wolves and moose," I replied, "but I've never heard of moose doing this." Max snapped a few pictures. "Maybe we'll go viral," he said, attempting a grin. "Teen documents mysterious forest creature. Click here to find out what happens next." "Let's keep moving," Tom suggested, picking up the pace. As we neared the split where we'd go our separate ways, me back to Rock Harbor, them to their campsite, Tom placed a hand on my shoulder. "You sure you don't want to join us for dinner again?" I smiled. "Thanks, but I think I'll turn in early tonight. Besides, I can't mooch off you guys forever." Lisa handed me a walkie-talkie. "Just in case. Channel 6, we'd feel better knowing we can reach you." I accepted it gratefully. "Thanks, I'll be fine. What's the worst that could happen?" We parted ways, and I headed back to my tent. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that danced eerily among the trees. I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, I came here to escape stress, not invent new reasons for it. Settling into my tent, I decided to review the photos I had taken. Scrolling through the images, one caught my eye. It was from the summit, a panoramic shot. But there, among the trees, was a dark shape that hadn't been there before. Zooming in didn't help. It only made the image grainier. "Probably just a trick of the light," I muttered. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig. Nothing out of the ordinary. I crawled into my sleeping bag, grateful for its warmth. Sometime later, I awoke to a faint crackling sound. At first, I thought it was rain, but the sky had been clear. Then I smelled it. Smoke. Unzipping my tent, I peeked outside to see a small fire burning near the tree line. That's not supposed to be there, I thought. Grabbing my flashlight, I cautiously approached. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just a random blaze. It was a campfire. Around it lay scattered belongings. A backpack, a hat, a hiking boot. No signs of people, though. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" Silence. I noticed the backpack had a name tag, Kevin Moore. Rifling through it seemed invasive, but I was concerned someone might be hurt. Inside, I found the usual: water bottle, trail mix, a map, but also a journal. Flipping it open, the last entry read, "Something is following me. I can hear it at night. If anyone finds this." A chill ran down my spine. Not the figurative kind people write about, but a genuine, icy dread. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. I decided to head back to my tent when the radio crackled. Just then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the night, echoing through the forest. It was human, filled with terror, and abruptly cut off. I sprinted back to my campsite, hands shaking as I fumbled with the walkie-talkie. "Tom, Lisa, do you copy? Tom? Max? Anyone?" Finally, a crackling response. "Timothy, what's going on?" "I heard a scream near my camp. Found someone's gear, but no person. Something's not right." "Stay put. We're on our way," Tom replied. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. I kept the flashlight beam moving, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Then, in the periphery of the light, I saw it. A massive silhouette lurking between the trees. It moved with a fluidity that was unnerving for something its size. I pointed the flashlight directly at it. The creature resembled a wolf, but stood upright like a human. Its fur was a mottled mix of grays and blacks. Its snout was elongated, teeth glinting as it snarled, eyes fixed on me. It let out a sound that was somewhere between a howl and a roar. My mind raced. This can't be real, I thought. Did someone spike my trail mix? Fight or flight kicked in, and flight won by a landslide. I bolted in the direction I hoped was toward Tom and Lisa. Behind me, I heard the creature crashing through the underbrush, gaining ground despite my adrenaline-fueled sprint. Ahead, I saw the beam of another flashlight. "Timothy!" Perez's voice shouted. "Run!" I yelled. "Go back!" But it was too late. The creature lunged between us, grabbing Max with clawed hands. He screamed as it dragged him into the darkness. "Max!" Lisa shrieked, dropping to her knees. Tom grabbed her arm. "We have to move!" I stood there, paralyzed by shock. Tom shook me. "Timothy, we need to get to safety now." We stumbled through the forest, the creature's guttural sounds echoing behind us. Reaching a rocky outcrop, we wedged ourselves into a narrow crevice. The creature couldn't fit but clawed at the entrance, its razor-like nails scraping against the stone. Lisa was sobbing uncontrollably. Tom held her, his face a mask of despair. "We have to do something," I whispered. "And what do you suggest?" Tom snapped. "Offered a s'more?" Despite the dire situation, a hysterical laugh bubbled up. "I always knew camping was a bad idea," I muttered. "Next time, I'm sticking to Netflix and chill." "Assuming there is a next time," Tom retorted. Hours seemed to pass as we huddled together. The creature eventually retreated, but we could hear it pacing nearby, waiting. "We can't stay here forever," Lisa whispered. "At dawn, we'll make a run for the ranger station," Tom decided. "Assuming that place is still standing," I added. Morning light filtered in, and the forest took on an almost serene appearance, betraying the horrors of the night. We cautiously emerged, every snap of a twig making us jump. The trek to the ranger station was tense but uneventful. When we arrived, the place looked as abandoned as before, but it was our only hope. Inside, we found an old radio. Tom fiddled with it. Come on, he urged. Static." Then a voice. "This is Ranger Dispatch. Identify yourself." "Help, we're at the old ranger station on Isle Royale. Something attacked us. Our friend is missing," Tom blurted out. "Stay where you are. We're dispatching a team," the voice replied. Hours passed, each minute stretching longer than the last. Suddenly, the door burst open. Not rescuers, the creature. It had tracked us. It lunged at Tom, who tried to fend it off with a rusted fire poker. "Get Lisa out of here," he shouted. I grabbed Lisa's hand, pulling her toward the back door. "We can't leave him," she protested. "We don't have a choice." As we stumbled outside, a gunshot rang out. Startled, we turned to see Tom standing over the creature, a flare gun in his hands. The beast writhed on the floor, momentarily incapacitated. "Didn't think that would actually work," Tom said, breathing heavily. We didn't waste time celebrating. Together, we ran toward the shoreline, hoping to signal any passing boats. Reaching the water's edge, we waved frantically as a ferry appeared in the distance. Behind us, the creature emerged once more, smoke still rising from its singed fur. It was wounded but relentless. "Keep going," Tom urged. As the ferry drew closer, a group of park rangers aboard spotted us. And the creature. They shouted orders we couldn't make out, but their raised rifles were a welcome sight. A volley of shots rang out. The creature let out a final, agonized howl before collapsing. The rangers escorted us onto the ferry. One of them, a stern-looking woman named Officer Delgado, questioned us about the incident. "You're lucky to be alive," she said. "We've had reports of missing hikers, but nothing concrete until now." "What was that thing?" Lisa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Officer Delgado exchanged glances with her team. "We've got some theories, but nothing official. The island has its secrets." Back on the mainland, we gave our statements to the authorities. They assured us they'd investigate further, but something in their eyes told me they weren't expecting to find anything. A week later, news reports surfaced about the discovery of remains on Isle Royale, bones that didn't quite match any known species. Experts were baffled, speculating everything from undiscovered wildlife to elaborate hoaxes. As for Max, he was never found. A memorial service was held, but closure remained elusive. In the end, the island was closed to the public indefinitely. Official statements cited environmental concerns, but we knew better. I returned to city life as the noise and crowds now a strange comfort. Occasionally, I'd catch myself scanning the headlines, looking for any mention of unexplained events in remote places. One day, a package arrived at my door. Inside was a journal, the same one I'd found at the abandoned camp. How it got to me, I had no idea. Attached was a note. Thought you might want this, Officer Delgado. Flipping through the pages, I noticed new entries in handwriting that wasn't mine. They detailed sightings of creatures across various national parks, all eerily similar to what we'd encountered. It seemed the island wasn't the only place hiding secrets. I closed the journal and stared out the window at the cityscape. Maybe isolation wasn't the escape I thought it would be. My name is Austin Gibson. I'm 42 years old, and I swear on everything I have left that what happened in Apalachicola National Forest was real. I don't drink anymore. I can't, because every time I do, I see that thing's face grinning back at me in the dark. I drove my old RV into the forest a few years ago, thinking I needed some time alone after the divorce. I wasn't sleeping much. My hands shook if I wasn't holding a beer. My ex-wife Lisa said I needed help, but what I needed was space. Silence. So I packed up took a few cases of whiskey, and drove out to the deepest part of Apalachicola, where no one would bother me. The road was bad, worse than I expected. The deeper I went, the more the trees closed in, thick moss hanging from the branches like dead fingers. I didn't see another car for miles. That's how I wanted it. Just me, the swamp, and enough liquor to make me forget why I was out there in the first place. I found a clearing near the water and parked. No cell service, no radio reception, just the sound of frogs and the occasional rustling in the brush. The air was thick, humid as hell, and the sun was already sinking. The first thing that went wrong was the RV's battery. I killed the engine, went outside to take a leak, and when I came back, the lights wouldn't turn on. No power, no reason for it either. The damn thing had been fine all the way there. I figured I'd deal with it in the morning. That night, I sat by the fire, drinking, trying not to think about Lisa or the divorce, or the fact that I had nowhere to go when I got back. Then the knocking started. Soft, like fingertips against the metal. I turned my head slowly toward the RV. Nothing. Probably a branch, I told myself. Or an animal. I went inside, locking the door behind me. I lay down on the small cot, listening. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat. It was coming from the other side now, near the back window. I grabbed my flashlight and yanked open the curtain. Nothing but darkness. I shut the curtain, turned over, and tried to sleep. At some point in the night, the radio turned on. It hadn't worked in years. The damn thing was busted, fried from an old battery issue. But now it crackled with static. And through it, a song started playing. Lisa used to love that song. But the lyrics were wrong. The voice singing was off, slow, stretched, like someone mimicking a record player at half speed. I yanked the power knob. The music stopped. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went outside to check the engine. That's when I saw the footprints. Not mine. They circled the RV, stopping right outside my window. Bare footprints, too long, like the toes had been stretched out. I told myself it was some local screwing with me, someone trying to scare me off. I decided I'd had enough of that spot, so I packed up to leave. Got in the driver's seat, turned the key. Nothing. The RV wouldn't start. I opened the hood, checked the wires. Everything looked fine, but it was like the engine was just dead, like the damn thing had given up. I was stuck. That's when I saw the man in the trees, far off, just standing between the pines, his head tilted, watching me. I called out, but he didn't move. I took a step forward. "Hey, buddy, you lost?" He took a step back, fading into the shadows. I ran toward where he had been, but by the time I got there, the trees were empty. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. I went back to camp, locking myself in the RV even though I knew that wouldn't do much. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the engine, trying to find some rational explanation. Then the knocking came back. But this time, it was coming from the door. I froze. Knock, knock, knock. I swallowed hard, gripping the handle of my knife. "Who's there?" Silence. Then a voice. Low calm. "Danny." My breath hitched. "Lisa." I backed away from the door. The handle rattled. "Danny, let me in." My hands shook. My head felt light. I hadn't spoken to Lisa in weeks. She wasn't here. She couldn't be here. I peeked out the window. She was standing there. Lisa, in the blue dress she wore the night she left me. Her hair down, Her lips curled in that soft little smile she used to give me when we were happy. I squeezed my eyes shut. I was hallucinating. The booze, the stress, that was all it was. When I opened my eyes, she was closer, right outside the window, smiling, too wide, her lips curled back, revealing too many teeth. I screamed and threw myself back. The knocking stopped. I didn't open the door. I didn't sleep. The next day, I tried to hike out. No matter how far I walked, I always ended up back at the RV. By sunset, I was losing my mind. Then the park ranger showed up. He came walking down the path like nothing was wrong, clipboard in hand. "You lost, sir?" I ran up to him. "Jesus, man, you gotta help me. My RV's dead. Then I saw his badge. Holloway, my last name. I stepped back. "What the hell?" He just smiled. "You're not supposed to be here, Danny." I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, but no matter which way I went, I always ended up back at that damn RV. That night, the radio came on again. This time, it wasn't music. It was a voice, deep, laughing. "You're almost ready to let go." I covered my ears. "Shut up. Shut the hell up." The mirror in the RV cracked, and my own face smiled back at me. "Danny," it whispered, "you know why she left." I backed away, shaking. No. You were driving drunk. The air went out of my lungs. "You crashed." I shook my head. No, she left me." My reflection grinned wider. She didn't leave. She never left. And then I remembered. The rain that night, the headlights spinning, the crunch of metal. I never called the cops. I passed out, woke up in the wreckage, stumbled home, convinced myself she'd just left. But she was still out there, somewhere in the swamp, buried. I fell to my knees, my head in my hands. The voice whispered in my ear, "You can stay here, Danny, or you can let go." I don't know what made me do it, but I grabbed the bottle of whiskey and smashed it against the RV's floor. I lit a match. The fire spread fast. The voice screamed. The last thing I saw before I passed out, Lisa, standing in the flames, smiling. I woke up on the side of the road. My truck was there. The road was dry. The sky was clear. I drove out of that forest and never looked back. But sometimes, at night, I hear the knocking, and when I look in the mirror, I see my own face, smiling back. My name is Randy Smith, and back in 2018, I decided to take my RV up to Lake Superior Provincial Park in Ontario for some peace and quiet. Being cooped up in the city was starting to make me feel like a sardine in a can, and I figured some fresh air might do me good. Besides, I've always believed that nature and I have an understanding. I don't bother it, and it doesn't bother me. I've never been the rugged outdoorsman type. My idea of hiking involves a well-marked trail and a picnic at the end. But the allure of the open road and the promise of solitude were too tempting to pass up. So I packed my essentials, a week's worth of snacks, a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and enough coffee to fuel a small army. The drive was picturesque, with the trees flaunting their autumn colors like they were showing off. By the time I reached the park, the sun was casting golden hues over the lake, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I found a secluded spot near the water, set up camp, and made myself a cup of coffee. This isn't so bad, I thought. Maybe I should write a book, Randy's Adventures in the Wild. As dusk settled, I decided to light a campfire. There's something hypnotic about watching flames dance. It's like nature's television. I was roasting marshmallows, because what's a camping trip without s'mores? When I heard footsteps crunching leaves behind me. "Evening," a voice said. I turned to see a man standing at the edge of my campsite. He was tall and gaunt, with unkempt hair and clothes that looked like they'd been through a war zone. His eyes had a peculiar glint, one that made me instinctively uneasy. "Evening," I replied cautiously. "Can I help you with something?" "Just passing through," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Jedediah, but folks call me Jed." "Randy," I offered, though he hadn't asked. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" He stepped closer, eyeing the marshmallows. "Sure is. Mind if I join you for a bit?" Every alarm bell in my head was ringing, but I didn't want to be rude. Actually, I was just about to turn in, long drive and all. He tilted his head, the smile fading. "Fair enough. You take care now." "Will do," I said, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Well, that wasn't creepy at all," I muttered, deciding it was indeed time to call it a night. I extinguished the fire and secured the RV. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine. I convinced myself that I'd overreacted the night before. Maybe Jed was just a harmless drifter. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail. I left a note on the dashboard, a habit from watching too many true crime shows, grabbed my backpack, and set off. The trail was serene, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and leaves crunching underfoot. I was about an hour in when I noticed something odd, a campsite just off the path. But it looked abandoned. Curious, I ventured closer. Tents were collapsed, and belongings were strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. Unease settled in my stomach. This is how people end up in horror movies, I joked nervously to myself. I decided to head back. As I turned, I nearly bumped into Jed. "Whoa, you startled me," I exclaimed. "Sorry about that," he said, though he didn't sound sorry at all. "What brings you here?" "Just hiking," I replied, trying to sound casual. "You?" "Same," he said, his gaze fixed on me. "Shame about what happened here." "Yeah, looks like they left in a hurry," he chuckled softly. "Or something made them leave." I swallowed hard. "Well, I should get going." "Don't let me keep you," he said, stepping aside. I walked briskly back to the trail, feeling his eyes on me the whole time. By the time I reached my RV, my heart was pounding. Maybe it's time to move on to another site, I thought. I started packing up when I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, half expecting Jed, but it was another man, this one wearing a park ranger uniform. "Sorry to startle you," he said. "I'm Ranger Thompson, just making my rounds." "Oh, thank goodness," I sighed in relief. "Randy Farnsworth. Everything all right? You look a bit shaken." I debated whether to mention Jed, but decided I might sound paranoid. "Just had an odd encounter earlier. Do you know a man named Jedediah around here?" The ranger's expression darkened. "Jedediah Clark?" "Yeah, goes by Jed." He nodded grimly. "We've had reports about him. I'd advise you to be cautious. He's not well." "Not well how?" I pressed. "Look, it's probably best if you relocate to a more populated area of the park," he suggested. "Safety in numbers." "Understood," I said, feeling a knot in my stomach. "Thanks for the warning." As he left, I hurried to finish packing. Just as I was about to start the engine, I realized I'd left my map on the picnic table. I stepped out to grab it, when something heavy struck me from behind. Everything went black. I awoke to a splitting headache and found myself tied to a chair inside what looked like an old cabin. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting eerie shadows on the walls adorned with hunting trophies. "Rise and shine?" came Jed's voice from the darkness. "What do you want?" I demanded, struggling against the ropes. He stepped into the light, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Company. Is that too much to ask?" "Kidnapping isn't exactly the way to make friends," I retorted. He laughed. "Oh, but we're past pleasantries now. Look, if it's money you want—" "Money?" he interrupted. "You think this is about money? No, all this is about survival." "Survival?" He began pacing. "City folks like you come here thinking you own the place, leaving your trash, making noise, disrupting the balance. I'm sorry if I—" "Too late for apologies," he snapped. "You and your kind are a blight." "You're not making any sense," I said, trying to keep him talking while I worked at the knots. He pulled out a hunting knife, examining it thoughtfully. "Sense? Sense is living off the land, respecting its laws, not hiding in metal boxes on wheels." "Okay, noted. I'll just be on my way and promise to leave nature untouched," I said. He shook his head slowly. "Can't let you do that." Before I could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. "Jedediah Clark, this is Ranger Thompson. Open up!" Jed's eyes flickered with rage. "You just couldn't stay quiet, could you?" As he moved toward the door, adrenaline surged through me. I managed to loosen the ropes enough to free one hand. Without thinking, I grabbed a heavy wooden stool and waited. As Jed turned back, I swung with all my might. The stool connected with his shoulder, causing him to drop the knife and stumble. "You little," he growled. I didn't wait for him to finish. I bolted for the back door, bursting into the cool night air. My RV was parked nearby, and I sprinted toward it, fumbling with the keys. As I jumped inside and started the engine, I saw Jed appear in the side mirror, fury etched on his face. I didn't look back. Later, I learned that Jed had been evading capture for months. He was a former survivalist who lost his grip on reality after a tragic accident claimed his family. As for me, next time someone suggests a nature trip, I'll politely decline. I'm outdoorsy in that I like having drinks on patios. My name is Austin Gibson, and this happened back in 2011 in Shawnee National Forest, Illinois, when I first took a temporary ranger job there to help with the busy fall season. Never suspecting I'd leave that place with shaking hands and a heart full of questions. I remember stepping into that small ranger station around late September, feeling pretty good because I'd managed to snag a cheap motel room in town that morning. I had a bland cheese sandwich for breakfast, just something out of the convenience store freezer section, and washed it down with watery coffee. I wore a faded uniform passed down from a previous hire who'd left mustard stains near the left pocket. It smelled like stale sweat and cheap detergent, but I was just glad to have work. I was 25, broke, and eager to prove myself reliable. I liked the quiet of the forest trails, the dense maples and oaks, and the smell of damp leaves after last week's rain. We had a small team, just me and 2 others on rotation that day. Tom, older and with a bushy beard that he tied with a rubber band, always joked about his ex-wife and how her new husband sold fancy lawnmowers. And Gina, in her early 40s, usually wore a baseball cap over short-cropped hair. She had a habit of humming some old tune I couldn't place whenever she got nervous. She'd say, "Pat, you know that feeling when you think the woods are just a bit too still?" I didn't know what she meant back then. I thought forests were supposed to be quiet. That morning, Gina handed me a radio and said, "Don't wander off without checking in. It's not summer camp season, but we still get the odd hiker." By noon, I was on a trail known as Pine Hollow Path, which, despite the name, had more oaks than pines. The canopy let through thin beams of light, and the forest floor was scattered with red and brown leaves. I came across a half-eaten energy bar wrapper on the path, which struck me as odd because we usually lectured visitors about leaving no trash. I stuffed it in my pocket. About an hour later, I stumbled on something far more disturbing, a torn jacket sleeve snagged on a low branch. It looked recent, maybe a day old, and the fabric was stiff with something dark. I didn't want to think about it. That's when I radioed Tom. "Hey, found a torn piece of clothing. Could be a lost hiker. Anything on the logs?" Tom answered with a yawn. "We had a party of 3 who checked in yesterday. They should have been out by now." That sent a chill into my chest, and I began scanning the underbrush with more care. I followed a faint trail of broken twigs and disturbed leaves off the main path. About 20 feet in, I smelled something unpleasant, like old meat left out on a warm countertop. I advanced slowly, heart tapping at my ribs. In a small clearing behind a fallen tree, I found the body of a man. He looked about 40, wearing a hiking vest and boots. His left arm lay twisted at a strange angle, and part of his torso had been torn open. The sight made my stomach lurch. I stepped back, pressed my hand against my mouth, and tried to breathe through it. Then I spoke into the radio with forced calm. "Tom," I said, "I've got a deceased male hiker here. Looks like an animal attack." Gina broke in, her voice uneasy. "Animal attacks are rare here. Are you sure?" I didn't answer her. I just gave them my coordinates. While I waited, I squatted down, thinking maybe the poor guy slipped and got mauled by a coyote or something. But coyotes don't usually leave bodies like that. I took in the surroundings, noticing deep scratches on a nearby tree trunk, higher than my shoulders. There was a pattern, something I couldn't quite place. But it definitely wasn't from a raccoon or a bobcat. When Tom and Gina arrived, they were both grim-faced. Tom tried to hide his shock. Gina stopped humming. She just stared and shook her head. We decided to search for the other 2 hikers from that party of 3. Tom radioed the station to call for authorities. We couldn't just leave, not with the possibility of survivors. We moved deeper into the woods, spreading out but staying close enough to yell if something happened. I remember wiping sweat off my forehead, even though it wasn't that hot. The silence weighed on me. Sometimes a branch cracked underfoot, and I jumped. Then we found another body. This time, it was a woman, slumped against a boulder. Her pack was gone, her face frozen in a look of pain. She had similar wounds, and the ground around her was stained and scattered with damp leaves. I wish I hadn't eaten that cheese sandwich earlier. "Hello? Anybody out here?" I called. No answer. I heard Tom whisper, "This is bad, Pat." I nodded, my mouth dry. Gina, who walked a short distance away, suddenly shouted, "Found footprints!" We hurried over. There were large impressions in the soft earth, bigger than any mountain lion print I'd seen in guides. They looked like a cat's, but heavier. Deeper. A cougar? Tom asked. Gina shrugged. Not impossible, but she trailed off. Something about these tracks bothered her. They showed long strides, more powerful than what we expected. We decided to keep searching for the third hiker. The afternoon light was fading, and we had to use flashlights. Being out there as dusk approached set me on edge. I found myself talking just to break the tension. "Tom, remember that big raccoon we saw by the dumpsters yesterday?" Tom grunted. I tried a lame joke. "If that raccoon shows up now, I'll offer him my last candy bar to watch our backs." No one laughed. Then, at twilight, we heard a scream, quick and sharp. We ran toward it, stumbling over roots and rocks. We found the third hiker, alive at first. A young guy in his 20s, holding his side, crouched under a half-fallen tree. "Help!" he shouted, voice cracking. We rushed over, flashlights jumping. He looked terrified, eyes darting behind us as if expecting something to pounce. It took them. "It's out here." He didn't have to say more. We heard heavy steps in the brush, a soft rustling that made my skin prickle. We formed a semicircle around the wounded hiker, shining our beams into the dark trees. I saw a shape then, low and muscular, moving between trunks. No distinct silhouette, just movement. My heart thundered. Then it rushed forward. I could barely describe its form. A cat-like body, maybe 5 feet long, thick shoulders, dark fur that blended with the night. It moved quietly, at first. Then, thump! It slammed into the injured hiker. He screamed. We shouted, shining lights into its face. I saw powerful jaws flash open and close. The man's screams turned into choking gasps. I stepped forward, but Tom grabbed my shoulder. "Pat, no! It's too late." Gina swung her flashlight at the creature's head, and it hissed, a strange, sharp sound. Then it ran off into the darkness, leaving the man on the ground. He was gone, and that was only the beginning. We knelt beside him. He was gone. It had ended his life in seconds. Gina cursed under her breath. Tom looked like he might cry. I felt sick again, kneeling there, trying to hold my flashlight steady. Now we had 3 dead hikers, a killer animal somewhere in the woods, and night pressing in on all sides. We made a plan to retreat to the station. The radio crackled as we tried to call for backup. Spotty reception. "We need the phone," I said. Tom nodded. We hurried back along the trail, our flashlights bouncing over tree trunks and roots. Gina whispered, "Don't run. Running sets it off." We moved briskly but tried to look calm, which was impossible. I gripped my radio so hard my knuckles hurt. Halfway back, we realized something was keeping pace with us. Branches snapped lightly. I tried to catch a glimpse but only saw shifting silhouettes. We picked up speed. "I'll buy us all dinner if we get out of this," I muttered. No one responded. I suppose we all wanted to pretend we were anywhere else, maybe at a diner with French fries and milkshakes, not stuck in the dark with a vicious predator. At one point, Tom lagged behind to catch his breath. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll be right there." Gina and I stopped, turned back. "Don't be stupid," she said. "We stick together." He nodded and lumbered forward, chest heaving. He was bigger than me, maybe 50 pounds heavier, and the fear weighed on him. We formed a tight group, shining lights in every direction. The woods smelled damp and earthy, and every sound set me on edge. We reached a fork in the path. By then, I noticed fresh scratches on the bark of a large oak, long, parallel marks, too clean to be random. We heard a sudden snapping of twigs and spun around. The creature rushed past our lights so fast I barely saw more than a dark shape. Tom shouted, "There!" but it moved in a blur. Gina and I tried to stand back to back with him. We breathed in quick, shallow gasps. I held a length of sturdy branch I'd picked up, though I doubted it would help much. A moment passed, maybe less. Then it struck again, hitting Tom this time. I swung the branch wildly, hitting only air. I saw Tom on the ground, coughing, struggling. Gina screamed at me to help him. I knelt and tried to pull him up. His chest and shoulder were torn, and his hands shook as he reached for me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I tried to stop the bleeding with my jacket, but it was too much. His eyes fluttered. I pleaded, "Come on, Tom. Don't leave me here, man." He said nothing else. Gina stood guard, flashlight shaking in her grip. The forest was too silent again. After a minute, I realized Tom was gone. My eyes stung with tears. I swallowed hard and said, "Gina, we have to run." We ran. I know I said not to run earlier, but we had no choice. Our boots pounded the dirt. The station wasn't far. The creature crashed through the brush behind us, keeping pace. My lungs burned, and my mind spun. I tried to recall if there was a service rifle locked at the station. Maybe. Maybe not. Anything would help. Gina was ahead of me, her flashlight beam shaking. We broke through the last stand of trees and saw the faint light from the station's bulb. I fumbled for the door, keys rattling. Inside, I slammed it shut and pushed a heavy cabinet against it. Gina collapsed into a chair, gasping. "We lost Tom," she said flatly. I nodded, pressing my forehead against the door. We tried the landline phone, static. We tried the radio, no immediate response. Maybe the call had gone out earlier and help was on the way. Maybe not. While Gina searched for a first aid kit, I peered out a small window. Nothing but darkness and the suggestion of trees. I listened hard, hearing only the hum of the station's small fridge. There was a box of flares on a shelf, and I pulled one out, thinking maybe we could signal someone. I waited, half expecting the animal to burst in. But it didn't. Hours passed. Gina stayed quiet. I remember rummaging through a drawer and finding a half-eaten bag of pretzels. My throat was too tight to swallow. As the first hint of dawn broke, we dared to open the door a crack. The forest looked normal, dew on leaves. Pale light filtering through. No sign of the creature. No strange prints by the door. Nothing. We stepped outside, tense, every sense sharpened. We didn't talk about going back to look for the bodies. We just knew we had to get the proper authorities and show them. We found a ranger truck behind the station, old, but it ran. Gina drove while I clutched the flare gun. My hands trembled with every bump in the dirt road. We made it out. But we carried what we saw inside our minds. When the sheriff's deputies and wildlife officers arrived later that day, they searched in teams, rifles ready. They found the bodies. They found unusual tracks. But I never heard a confident explanation. Maybe a rogue predator wandered in from another region. Maybe something escaped from a private collector's estate. I don't know. Gina and I never got a satisfying answer. They patrolled heavily for weeks. Nothing else turned up. Eventually, people said it must have been a one-time tragedy. I still think about it. I still see that creature's eyes in the beam of my flashlight. Sometimes, I wonder if it slipped away to another stretch of forest, still hungry, still waiting to surprise someone. I can't shake that thought. Even today, when I step outside at dusk, I pause and listen harder than I did before, just in case. My name is Logan Cooper, and this happened to me on September 14th, 1994. I've been a search and rescue officer for almost 2 decades now. I've seen a lot, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the fall of '88. It was one of those years when the forest seemed to breathe easier, the air crisp and cool, the leaves transforming into a kaleidoscope of red, orange, and yellow. Most of my days were spent patrolling the trails and helping lost hikers find their way back. It was a job I loved, one that gave me a sense of purpose and connection to nature. It started as a regular Friday. I was in the ranger station, sipping on a cup of coffee, the kind that's more bitter than soothing, when the call came in. A family reported their teenage son missing. They were camping in the dense woods of the Cascade Range, near a spot we locals called Blackwood Hollow. It wasn't a popular area. In fact, it was pretty remote, which made it all the more concerning. The boy, Kyle Thompson, had been missing for nearly 12 hours. I grabbed my gear, radioed my partner Rick, and we headed out. Rick was a good guy. a bit younger than me, with a sharp mind and quick wit. We joked about how every rescue mission felt like we were stepping into an old western, with us as the cowboys riding into the unknown. We reached Blackwood Hollow by late afternoon. The place had an eerie calm to it, a stillness that seemed to swallow sound. We met Kyle's parents at their campsite. They were frantic, the mother on the verge of tears, the father pacing like a caged animal. They explained that Kyle had wandered off the previous night, saying he was going to explore, but he never came back. Rick and I started our search, moving in a grid pattern, calling out Kyle's name. We had a good system, years of experience between us. As dusk settled, the forest grew darker, and our flashlights barely cut through the thickening gloom. There's something about the woods at night that gets under your skin, makes you feel like you're being watched. About an hour in, we found Kyle's backpack. It was lying at the base of a massive oak tree, partially covered in leaves. Inside were typical teenage things: a flashlight, some snacks, a notebook, but no sign of Kyle. We pressed on, our shouts becoming more urgent. Then we heard it, a faint, distant cry. It was hard to pinpoint, but it was there. We followed the sound, moving quickly now, the urgency driving us forward. The cries led us deeper into the forest, to a part I wasn't familiar with. The trees were denser, the path narrower. It felt like we were being funneled into a trap. We came upon a clearing, and there, in the middle, was a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, windows shattered, roof caved in. The cries were louder now, coming from inside. Rick and I exchanged a look. This wasn't right, but we had to find Kyle. We approached the cabin cautiously, flashlights sweeping the area. I called out, "Kyle, you in there?" No response, just the continued whimpering. We pushed the door open and the smell hit us first, damp, rotting wood mixed with something metallic. Blood. Inside, the place was a mess. Furniture overturned, debris everywhere. In the corner, we saw him, Kyle, huddled and trembling, eyes wide with fear. But he wasn't alone. Standing over him was a figure, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Before we could react, the figure lunged at Rick, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen. Rick went down, and I barely had time to draw my knife. I slashed at the figure, connecting with something solid. It hissed, a sound that made my skin crawl, and retreated into the shadows. I grabbed Kyle, pulling him to his feet. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted out of the cabin. Rick was on the ground, clutching his side but alive. We made it to the clearing before I dared to look back. The figure was standing in the doorway, watching us, but it didn't follow. We helped Rick up, and with Kyle between us, we made our way back to the campsite as fast as we could. The whole time, I felt like we were being hunted, the trees closing in around us. But we didn't stop, didn't look back, until we were safely at the ranger station. Kyle's parents were relieved, their gratitude evident, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Rick was taken to the hospital, his wound deep but not life-threatening. I stayed behind, trying to piece together what had happened. The authorities were called, and a search was conducted. But the cabin was never found. Kyle's memory was hazy, filled with fragments of a nightmare he couldn't fully recall. He mentioned being lured by a voice, something that seemed human but wasn't. Weeks passed, and the incident was quietly swept under the rug. Officially, it was chalked up to a bear attack, though anyone who'd seen the wounds knew better. Rick recovered, but he left the job soon after. Said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. I stayed on, but Blackwood Hollow became a place I avoided. The forest felt different, like it had secrets best left undisturbed. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I sometimes hear that faint cry, a reminder of the things that lurk in the shadows of our world. Years later, the memory still haunts me. Not just the encounter, but the sense of helplessness. The realization that there are things out there beyond our understanding. Kyle grew up, moved away, tried to forget. But I couldn't. It became a part of me, a shadow that followed wherever I went. One night, I was having a beer with an old friend, Jason. He was another ranger, one who had his own stories of the strange and unexplainable. We were sitting on my porch, watching the stars, When I finally told him about that night in Blackwood Hollow, he listened, a thoughtful look on his face, then nodded. "I've heard similar stories," he said. "Different places, different faces, but the same kind of presence. Some say it's a spirit. Others think it's something more primal, more ancient." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging in the air. It didn't bring me comfort, but it felt good to share the burden, to know I wasn't alone in my experience. Life went on, as it does. I kept doing my job, helping those lost in the wilderness, always with a cautious eye on the tree line. I never went back to Blackwood Hollow, and neither did Rick. It became one of those places with a story attached, a whispered legend among the rangers. In the end, I think that's what it was, a legend, something that exists on the edges of our reality, only revealing itself when we stray too far into the unknown. And maybe that's for the best. Some things are meant to remain hidden, their mysteries left unsolved. I still wonder about that night, about what I saw and what might have happened if we hadn't escaped. It's a question that lingers, unanswered, a reminder of the thin line between our world and whatever lies beyond. And as long as I'm alive, I'll carry that memory with me, a testament to the things we'll never fully understand. It all started with an offhand joke. You hear enough bad jokes in my line of work, but this one stood out. It was 2004, somewhere deep in the North Carolina woods, the kind of place tourists don't even know exists. I had been on 100 missions before, but this one seemed simple. Find the locals who had gone missing and bring them back, dead or alive. I joined the Green Berets for the adrenaline, for the chance to do something meaningful. But over the years, that rush started to fade, until that damn joke. Some of the local cops, the ones I was meant to coordinate with, had this thing where they'd whisper around me like they were afraid to say something out loud. One of them, a big guy named Remy, who always chewed tobacco and spat on his own boots, leaned in one night while I was cleaning my rifle and said, "The woods don't like strangers much. They got their own rules. And yeah, sometimes they eat folks who break them." I remember rolling my eyes and grunting something about old wives' tales, but it stuck with me. I mean, I'd been through enough to know that when locals get weird, there's usually a reason. So I took it as a heads up, though I didn't believe in superstitions. Not then, anyway. By the time we got out there, me, Remy, and a few other locals we picked up, the sun was slipping low behind the trees, giving us just enough time to set up a base camp. I didn't like the idea of working with the local guys, especially Remy, who cracked more jokes than a man should, but orders are orders. One of them, Pete, had lived out here all his life. He swore he'd seen bears doing strange things, but I didn't pay it much mind. Bears don't take people whole, and they sure as hell don't drag them away without leaving a mess. Remy, Pete, and I split up to cover more ground. Remy took the creek bed. Pete took the ridge above it. That left me with the thickest part of the woods, where the trees leaned in close like a suffocating crowd. I could feel the humidity seeping through my clothes. The air smelled like pine and something rotten underneath. It wasn't long before I found my first clue. A bloody shirt, half buried under a pile of leaves. Like something had tried to hide it, but didn't care to do it right. The thing about finding blood is, it's never a good sign. But this wasn't the splatter of a struggle or the spray you get when something big goes down. No, this was something else. Methodical. I pressed on, radioing Remy and Pete every 15 minutes like we'd planned. No answers, but I could hear faint static, just enough to know the radios weren't dead. It's just that they weren't responding. By dusk, I found more. Pieces of a tent, torn like they'd been shredded by claws, though not the kind you'd expect. No signs of struggle, no trap, just a creeping sense that something was off. Then I found the bones, not scattered, not chewed, laid out in a pattern. Deliberate, like someone had taken their time setting them out, like a child making a stick figure in the dirt. There was no mistaking it. Human. I cracked another joke over the radio, something dumb about arts and crafts, but got nothing back. The silence sat heavy, but I pushed on. Maybe they were messing with me? trying to scare the new guy from out of town. That's when I heard it, a snapping sound, low to the ground, like someone or something breaking branches. I kept my rifle at the ready and pushed through a thicket. That's when I spotted Remy's body, or at least what was left of it, slumped against a tree, his guts spilled out like someone had unzipped him. There was no sign of Pete. I didn't get close enough to see much more because of what stood over Remy's corpse. It looked like a wolf. If wolves walked on two legs, its fur was matted, dripping with blood that wasn't its own. Its teeth, longer, thinner than they should be, gleamed in the dim light. It didn't look right, didn't move right. My first thought was that maybe it was a man, some freaky local in a getup, trying to scare me. But then it crouched low, sniffing at the air, and I knew better. This thing wasn't interested in me, at least not yet. I dropped down, hoping the thick brush would hide me. My breath came out in short bursts. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might hear me. I didn't have a clean shot, and this wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to miss. I watched it turn its head, almost like it was listening for something. Then it stood up and started walking toward the trees. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and I got the impression that whatever it was, it didn't belong in a world that made sense. I waited until it was far enough, then crawled back to where Remy lay, took what was left of his radio, and tried to call for backup. Static. Just static. Pete still wasn't responding either. I thought about turning back to camp, but I couldn't leave without knowing what happened to Pete. Maybe he found a way out. Maybe he was just lost in the dark. Or maybe he wasn't. I found Pete an hour later, hanging from a tree, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Below him, more bones. Some fresh, some old. There was a skull, cracked open like a walnut, and for the first time in my life, I was scared in a way I hadn't been, even when bullets were flying. This wasn't just about some missing folks anymore. This was a burial ground, a damn feeding ground. I've seen death before, but not like this, not methodical, not like a ritual. I radioed again, whispering this time, as if keeping my voice low might make me less real to whatever was out there. My rifle felt heavy, useless, but I kept it clutched in my hands like a lifeline. I needed to find a way back, but then I heard that same snapping sound, closer this time. It didn't come from the ground. It came from above. That's when I saw them. More of those things, climbing through the treetops like giant bats, their limbs twisting around branches like they had extra joints. There were at least 3 of them, but they moved so fast I couldn't keep count. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they'd miss me, but one of them leapt down, landing in front of me with a soft thud, like a cat dropping from a fence. I didn't think. I fired, 3 rounds into its chest. It staggered back, but the thing didn't go down. It shrieked, not like an animal, not like anything I had ever heard. A kind of sound that drilled into your skull and rattled around in your head. But it bled, and that gave me a sliver of hope. I fired again, aiming for its head, and this time it dropped, twitching on the ground like a dying fish. The others noticed. They dropped from the trees, their claws scraping bark as they hit the ground. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life, and I didn't look back, not even when I heard them crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were tearing apart, but I ran until I stumbled into a clearing and saw the lights of a cabin up ahead. I crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind me. An old man sat in a rickety chair by the fireplace, staring at me like I had just interrupted his dinner. He didn't seem surprised to see a soldier covered in blood, carrying a smoking rifle. He just looked at me, his expression flat, like he was watching a rerun of a TV show he'd seen 1,000 times before. I asked him if he had a phone, a radio, anything. He just shook his head and said, "They come for what they want, and then they leave. Always have." He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared past me, like he was looking through the walls. He started talking about the woods like they were alive, about how sometimes the forest decides who stays and who goes. I didn't have time for his riddles. I barricaded the windows, checked my ammunition, and asked him if he knew a way out. He just laughed, this low, gravelly sound that echoed in the small room. "You don't get out, son. You just survive. And then he went quiet, staring into the flames as if that was all that mattered. I watched through the window as the things circled the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight. One of them came closer, dragging something behind it. Pete's body. It left him just outside, like bait. That's when I made my decision. I grabbed a lantern and the last of my ammunition and told the old man to stay inside. He just nodded like he'd heard it all before. I stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a slap. They were waiting, their heads cocked to one side, like they were curious, like they wanted to see what I'd do. I lit the lantern, smashed it against the cabin wall, and watched as the flames leapt up, catching on the dry wood. I figured if I couldn't get out, I'd take them down with me. The fire spread fast, crackling through the walls, but the creatures didn't flinch. They just watched as the flames consumed the cabin. That's when I realized the old man wasn't just resigned. He was one of them, or something like them, part of whatever lived out there in the woods. I shot at one of the creatures, catching it in the leg. It stumbled, but didn't go down. The others lunged. I fought like hell, but they were faster. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it until I heard the snap. I dropped to the ground, fighting the pain as I clawed for my rifle, but they knocked it out of reach. Then they stopped. One of them let out a high-pitched yelp, and the others retreated into the shadows as if called back. I lay there, panting, my vision swimming. And then I saw it, their leader, standing on two legs, staring at me with something like curiosity. It leaned down close, sniffing the air, and then it turned and loped off into the trees, dragging Pete's body with it. I don't know why they left me alive. Maybe it was some twisted game. Maybe it was their way of letting me deliver the message. But as I lay there, staring up at the burning cabin, I realized what the old man meant. You don't get out. You just survive. And they let you remember. By dawn, a search party found me. They didn't find the old man, and they sure as hell didn't find Pete. They asked me what happened, but I didn't give them any answers they'd believe. They patched me up, got me out of the woods, and that was that. I left without saying a word. I got out, sure. But sometimes I think about Remy, about Pete, about what those things really are. Part animal, part nightmare. Maybe they were here long before us, just waiting for the woods to change back to the way they liked it. And then I heard the final joke from one of the locals, the one that almost made me laugh. Maybe the woods just didn't like your joke, stranger. My name is Brian Patel, and back in 2021, I embarked on an RV camping trip to the remote stretches of Idaho's Sawtooth National Forest. Ever since I was a kid, I found solace in the great outdoors. It's where I feel most at home, away from the hustle of city life and the constant ping of notifications. I had recently purchased a second-hand RV, a bit rusty around the edges, but still reliable. Friends joked that it had more character than horsepower. I liked it that way. I stocked up on essentials, loaded my mountain bike, and set off with the kind of optimism you get when escaping routine. The drive was tranquil, the kind where the radio fades into the background, and you're left alone with your thoughts. Pine trees blurred past as I navigated winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. About 100 miles into the forest, I found a clearing by a serene lake that looked like a postcard come to life. Setting up camp was straightforward. I parked the RV to face the water, propped open a chair, and cracked open a cold beer. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, reflecting off the lake's mirror-like surface. It was the kind of beauty that made you wonder why you didn't do this more often. The first night was uneventful, filled with the comforting sounds of nature. Crickets chirped in a harmonious chorus, while the gentle lapping of water against the shore acted as a lullaby. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in a blanket of stars visible through the RV's skylight. The next morning, I decided to take my bike out for a trail ride. The path was rugged, peppered with roots and rocks that demanded focus, a welcome challenge. About 5 miles in, I noticed something odd, a series of wooden symbols carved into the trees. They were intricate, almost artistic, but gave off an unsettling vibe. One looked like an eye, another like a hand, and others were shapes I couldn't decipher. I shrugged it off as local art or perhaps markers left by hikers. Maybe someone was trying to be the next Banksy of the wilderness. Still, a joke formed in my mind. If a tree gets vandalized in the forest and no one's around to see it, does it lower the property value? As the day wore on, the trail became denser. The canopy overhead thickened, allowing slivers of sunlight to pierce through like spotlights on a dim stage. I was about to turn back when I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin hidden behind a curtain of ivy and overgrown bushes. Curiosity got the better of me. The cabin looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Stepping inside, I was hit by a musty odor, a mix of damp wood and something else, something metallic. The interior was sparse, a broken table, a moldy chair, and strange symbols similar to the ones on the trees etched onto the walls. A sense of unease settled in my stomach. Maybe it's time to head back, I thought. But as I turned to leave, my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw the edge of a rug protruding from under the debris. I pulled it back to reveal a trapdoor. Now, any sensible person might have left right then, but I've been told that my curiosity could be the death of me. Hopefully just a figure of speech. I lifted the trapdoor, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. Using the flashlight from my bike kit, I illuminated the passageway. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the walls worn, with roots protruding like skeletal fingers. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a larger space, a room lined with shelves filled with jars. As I approached, the contents became horrifyingly clear. Preserved animals, odd specimens floating in formaldehyde, and other things that made my skin crawl. Then I saw them, photographs pinned to a corkboard, images of people, candid shots taken from a distance, hikers, campers, families. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized myself in one of the photos, taken at the lake where I'd set up camp. The caption scribbled below read, "New arrival. Alone." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Jokes aside, this was no laughing matter. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, a faint sound echoed down the tunnel, the unmistakable creak of the cabin's front door. Panic surged through me. I doused the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. Footsteps moved overhead, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were dragging something heavy. The sound of metal scraping against wood sent a shiver down my spine. I needed an escape route. Scanning the room, I noticed a narrow passage partially hidden behind a shelf. It was a tight squeeze, but it might be my only way out. I squeezed through, the rough walls scraping against my jacket. The passage led upward, curving slightly, until I found myself behind a thicket a few yards from the cabin. Peering through the leaves, I saw him. A tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He wore a stained flannel shirt and carried an old axe over his shoulder. He dropped a large sack onto the ground with a thud. Something rolled out, a deer carcass. Relief washed over me momentarily, until he pulled out a large hunting knife and began to skin the animal with unsettling precision. There was something methodical, almost ritualistic about his movements. I knew I had to get back to my RV and leave immediately. Keeping low, I moved silently through the underbrush, every snapped twig sounding like a gunshot in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the trail and mounted my bike, pedaling as fast as I could. The forest, which had seemed so inviting before, now felt like it was closing in on me. Shadows stretched longer, and every rustle of leaves sounded like impending danger. I reached my campsite, adrenaline pumping. Throwing my bike aside, I jumped into the RV and fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I didn't bother securing anything inside. Getting out was the only priority. As I steered onto the narrow road, a figure emerged from the tree line ahead, the same man from the cabin. He stood in the middle of the path, eyes fixed on me. There was no time to stop. I veered off to the side, the RV's tires crunching over rocks and roots. He didn't follow. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him watching me disappear down the road, a sinister smile creeping across his face. I drove non-stop until I reached the nearest town, a small community called Stanley. Pulling into a gas station, I parked and tried to collect myself. My hands trembled as I dialed the local sheriff's office. An officer named Deputy Harris arrived shortly after. He was a stout man with a firm handshake and a skeptical gaze. I recounted everything: the cabin, the photos, the man. He took notes but maintained a stoic expression. "You're not the first to report something like this," he admitted. "We've had a few hikers go missing over the past decade, but we've never found any concrete evidence." "Well, now you have a location," I insisted. "You have to check it out." He nodded. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay in town until we get this sorted." I agreed, though the idea of spending more time in the area was less than appealing. I checked into a small motel, the kind where the floral wallpaper hasn't changed since the 70s. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building made me jump. Around midnight, hunger got the better of me, and I decided to visit the all-night diner across the street. The place was nearly empty, except for a waitress and a lone customer seated at the counter. I took a booth by the window and ordered a coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, gave me a sympathetic smile. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that," I replied. The door chimed as another patron entered. Glancing up, my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from the cabin. He looked different, cleaner somehow, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans. He walked in casually and took a seat at the counter, 2 stools away from the other customer. Was it really him? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't be sure. I decided to play it cool and not draw attention to myself. The waitress greeted him warmly. "Evening, Caleb. The usual?" He nodded. "Thanks, Margie." Caleb. That was his name. He seemed familiar to her. A regular, maybe? I was mistaken, perhaps. Just a case of small-town residents bearing a resemblance to one another. I overheard snippets of their conversation. "How's the farm?" Margie asked. "Can't complain. Harvest season's been kind to us," he replied. I felt a wave of relief. This man seemed normal, friendly even. Maybe the stress was getting to me, causing me to see threats where there were none. Just then, the other customer at the counter stood up to leave. As he turned, I caught his face, a rugged-looking fellow with a scar running down his cheek. He gave me a nod and exited the diner. Caleb watched him leave, his friendly demeanor slipping ever so slightly. His gaze then shifted, locking eyes with me. A sly grin formed on his lips. "You're not from around here, are you?" he called out. I swallowed hard. "Just passing through," I answered. He picked up his coffee mug and walked over to my booth. "Mind if I join you?" Actually, I did mind, but I couldn't think of a polite way to refuse. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. He slid into the seat across from me. Up close, I could see a small tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, a series of symbols similar to those I'd seen carved into the trees and cabin walls. "Name's Caleb," he offered, extending his hand. "Brian," I replied, shaking it. "Unusual name. What's got you visiting our little corner of the world?" "Just some RV camping. Needed a break from city life." He nodded slowly. "The forest can be a peaceful place, or not, depending on where you wander." There was an edge to his voice now. The friendly facade was fading. "Yeah, had a bit of a scare earlier," I admitted, hoping honesty might diffuse whatever this was. "Came across an old cabin. Thought I saw something strange." "Strange things have a way of finding strangers," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. Margie interrupted by bringing over his meal, a bowl of chili and a slice of cornbread. "Here you go, hun." "Thanks," he replied, but his focus remained on me. I decided to test the waters. "You ever hear stories about that area? Maybe about people going missing?" He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Can't say I have, but then again, folks around here tend to mind their own business." Silence hung between us. I felt an urgent need to leave. "Well, it's getting late. I should probably head back." He smiled. "Of course. Don't let me keep you." I left a few bills on the table and stood up. As I turned to go, he spoke again. Be careful out there, Thaddeus. The woods aren't always as empty as they seem. I hurried back to the motel, every instinct telling me to get out of town immediately. Back in my room, I packed my belongings and decided to drive through the night. As I exited the motel, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Unfolding it, I saw it was one of the photographs from the cabin. This one of me, sitting by the lake, circled in red ink. Panic surged anew. I jumped into the RV and sped off, not caring about speed limits or the noise of the engine. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw headlights turn on and follow, but I couldn't be sure. After hours of driving, I crossed state lines and didn't stop until I reached a large town with plenty of people around. A few days later, I contacted the state police, providing them with all the information I had. They took my statement seriously and assured me they'd investigate. Weeks went by, and I received a call from a detective, Monroe. We searched the area you mentioned, he said. Found the cabin and the underground room. Did you find anything? I asked. Place was cleared out. No jars, no photographs, just an empty space. What about the man? Caleb? Local records show no one by that name matching your description. The diner you mentioned burned down last year. Margie, the waitress, died in the fire. A cold realization settled in. None of it made sense. Determined to find answers, I did some digging of my own. Online forums, local newspaper archives, anything that could shed light on what I'd experienced. I stumbled upon an old article from 1995 about a man named Caleb Foster, a farmer who was suspected of multiple disappearances but was never charged. He died in a car crash 2 decades ago, but that was impossible. I'd met him, or someone pretending to be him. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered in that small Idaho town. But I do know one thing. Some roads are better left untraveled. It was in 2008, somewhere in the middle of Montana, right near the edge of a national forest no one really bothered to visit. That was the point, though, wasn't it? A place no one paid attention to. My name is Austin Gibson. Yeah, I know. Sounds like a TV detective. But that's where the comparisons end. I wasn't chasing down bad guys in an old convertible. I was a grunt on a mission that wasn't supposed to be written down anywhere. They gave us vague orders: survey a part of the forest, collect data, watch for unusual activity, whatever that meant. Sounded more like a field trip than a military op, and we sure as hell weren't in uniform for this one. The forest was dense, trees twisted and grown wild like the land had a mind of its own. No trails, no clearings, just miles of green swallowing the sky. And when you're deep in a place like that, with the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and shadows creeping in from every angle, you get that prickling feeling, like you're walking into something's living room uninvited. We were a team of 4, all of us in civilian gear. James Chen, a guy with a background in tracking. Think of him as a walking encyclopedia for animal signs. Mario Costa, our medic, always had a dirty joke ready, usually about our moms. And Jan Walsh, the kind of guy who kept to himself but had the best poker face I'd ever seen. You never knew if he was joking or being serious, made him real annoying on a long mission. But he was solid when things went sideways. We set up camp about 12 clicks from the last known logging road in a clearing that barely qualified as one. No fire. Command had warned against it. Night came down fast, the kind that wraps around you and hides everything more than 5 feet away. Chen started in about mountain lions and grizzlies, like we needed reminding. Walsh cut in with a story about a guy he knew who'd been mauled. And then Costa, true to form, made some crack about how none of us would last a day on a dating app. The usual stuff to keep things light. Around midnight, we heard it. A sound that didn't fit. Not the wind, not a branch breaking, but something dragging itself over rocks, like nails scraping against gravel. Chen's head snapped up, his hand already on the rifle we weren't supposed to use unless absolutely necessary. We went quiet, listening, letting the forest swallow us. Walsh motioned forward, and we followed him in a staggered line, creeping through the underbrush. The noise led us to a narrow ravine about 100 yards from our camp. That's where we found the first body. A deer, but not any kind of kill I'd seen before. Its ribs had been pulled apart like someone tried to crack open a walnut and then gave up halfway. But it wasn't just that. Something had gnawed through its spine. Chen crouched over it, poking around with a stick. He muttered something about no tracks, no claw marks, but his voice shook a bit, like he didn't believe his own assessment. We turned back, leaving the carcass, figuring it was just a fluke, a one-off. That assumption didn't last. Not when we found the second one. This time, a fox, gutted and left tangled in the roots of a tree. And not when Costa stumbled upon the third. Something with too much blood for a small animal, splattered across the rocks like someone took a paint can to it. By the third day, we weren't talking much. We knew better than to spook each other. But hell, it's hard to stay calm when every other step you take, you feel like there's someone breathing down your neck. But still, we had orders. Collect the data, watch for anything odd, report back. Except there was no radio signal out there. So we were on our own until we made it back to the rendezvous point. That night, Costa disappeared. 1 minute, he was next to me, making some joke about the lack of cell service, and then he wasn't. We assumed he'd gone to take a leak. No one thought much of it, until 20 minutes passed. Then 30. I called out. Walsh too. Nothing. We grabbed flashlights and fanned out. I found his rifle just lying there against a tree, but no sign of him, no sound. It wasn't like Costa to just wander off. He wasn't the adventurous type. We spent the next few hours searching, but all we found was a smudge of blood on a tree trunk. Not enough to mean anything definite. Just a smear, like he'd cut his hand and touched the bark. Chen said maybe he fell into the ravine, broke something. But we checked there, and there wasn't a trace of him. That's when the dread settled in, thick and heavy. The next morning, we heard a scream. I've heard men scream before in combat when a bullet catches them in a bad spot. This wasn't like that. It came from the east, somewhere deep in the woods. We all froze, listening. Chen's face went pale. He muttered that it wasn't Costa, that it didn't sound like him. We moved toward the sound, rifles raised, hearts pounding like we were back in a firefight. We found Costa, all right, or what was left of him. His body lay face down, half submerged in a shallow stream, the back of his skull missing. But that wasn't what got to me. It was the way his limbs were twisted, like something had tried to pull him apart but hadn't finished the job. Chen lost it, started cursing, pacing back and forth, saying it didn't make sense. Kept repeating that there should have been tracks. But there was nothing. Just drag marks in the dirt that led into the thick trees. Walsh pointed out that Costa's sidearm was missing. That's when it hit us. He'd tried to fight back. Whatever took him, he'd put up a struggle. But it didn't matter. We should have left right then. Forget the mission. Forget the orders. Just hike out and get to the nearest town. But there's a kind of pride that keeps you from doing the smart thing. Maybe it was the training. Maybe it was that unspoken rule that you don't leave a man behind. So we stayed. We buried what was left of Costa under some rocks and pushed further into the forest, following those drag marks. Around noon, we found an old cabin, or what was left of it. Just some rotted wood and a chimney that leaned like it was tired of standing up. Chen went inside, looking for signs of life, but all he found was dust and an old bear trap, rusted shut. We were about to leave when I noticed something carved into the wood near the door. Symbols, almost like the kind you'd find in some backwoods superstition. Not that I believed in that stuff, but they looked fresh, like someone had scratched them in not too long ago. Walsh said we should keep moving, but I could tell he was just as spooked as the rest of us. As we stepped away, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees, a shadow that didn't quite fit, a shape that seemed to shift, then vanish when I blinked. Chen saw it too, and we shared a look. No one said anything. What was the point? We'd all seen it. We'd all seen too much already. No one said anything. What was the point? We'd all seen it. We'd all seen too much already. That night, we set up a perimeter, flashlights and a few makeshift traps. But it was a joke, really. Whatever took Costa wasn't going to trip over some wire and cans. We stayed awake in shifts, but sleep wouldn't have come anyway. Not with that feeling creeping over us like we were being studied. When it came to my turn, I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it again, just outside the circle of light. Something hunched and wrong. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar. It moved like a deer, but with limbs too long, like it didn't know how they were supposed to bend. It stepped forward just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face, or what I thought was a face. Too smooth, too human in a way that twisted your gut. I froze, finger on the trigger, but before I could take a shot, it bolted, silent as a whisper, back into the trees. I thought I imagined it. But then I heard the crash of branches behind me, Chen stumbling out of his position, his face pale. He'd seen it too. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, and he just shook his head. It came for us before dawn. A shriek cut through the air, and suddenly Walsh was gone. 1 second, he was beside me. The next, there was a smear of blood across the dirt where he'd been standing. Chen and I fired into the dark, not aiming, just shooting, hoping it would scare off whatever the hell was out there. For a second, I thought it worked, but then I heard a crunch behind me. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the ground, and there it was, dragging Walsh into the underbrush. I fired, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, and the thing dropped Walsh, but it didn't run. It just turned, twisted its neck to look at me, and I'll never forget that. The way it stared, like it was trying to decide if I was worth the effort. Chen charged it, knife in hand. He'd run out of bullets. It swiped at him, sent him sprawling into the dirt, but he got a good slice in, tore open its side. Something spilled out of it. Not quite blood, not quite anything I could identify. It let out a sound like an animal in pain, but worse. I grabbed Chen and we ran. Left everything behind, gear, supplies, Costa's grave. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We reached the edge of the forest just as the sun was coming up. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I didn't care. I kept dragging Chen along until we finally reached the nearest logging road. A beat-up truck was parked there, some old guy with a shotgun leaning against the hood. He looked at us, then at the blood on our clothes, and just nodded, like he'd seen it all before. He drove us to a town without asking questions. We didn't offer any answers. They called it a cougar attack when we reported it. Didn't even bother searching for Walsh or Costa. Just shrugged and said, "That's the way it goes out here." But I knew better, and so did Chen. Though he never talked about it again. Didn't even stay in touch. Last I heard, he moved down south. Said he needed to be somewhere flat, somewhere open. I went back to that forest once, years later, just to see if there was anything left of the cabin or the symbols on the door. But the place was gone, like it had never been there in the first place. No signs, no ruins, just trees and silence. But every so often, I hear about another missing hiker, another body found, torn open like a fruit. Maybe it's moved on, maybe it hasn't. But whatever it is, it's out there, and it's not done yet. Something that knows we're not supposed to be in its woods. And one of these days, someone's going to find out what it really is. Maybe they'll be luckier than we were, or maybe not. My name's Jeremy Harris, and this happened back in 1999 in the thick pine stretches of Idaho's Payette National Forest. Now, I'm not some storytelling type, but when you've seen what I've seen, it sits with you whether you want it to or not. I've been with the Forest Service for nearly a decade, mostly search and rescue, but I don't really get a thrill out of finding folks lost off the trails. It's just a job, pays the bills and keeps my folks from worrying too much. But this wasn't a typical day at work. The call came in just past noon. 2 teenagers had gone missing around Lake Cascade while hiking, and their mom swore up and down that they wouldn't have wandered off the marked trails. Typical, I thought. Parents always claim their kids aren't the type to take risks, and they end up climbing a cliffside or venturing miles off the paths. I radioed in, grabbed my pack, and met up with my buddy Matt Taylor at the ranger station. We'd handled plenty of search missions together, so we had our system down pat. By the time we started the hike, the sun was a half-hearted glow behind thick clouds, casting a dim grayness over the woods. We headed up the main trail, our boots crunching over the underbrush and fallen pine needles. I remember making some wisecrack about the kids probably sitting by the lake with no cell signal, blissfully unaware of the mini panic they'd sparked. Matt chuckled and responded with something about making up for our overtime with the stash of cold beers back at the station. Just another day on the job, or so I thought. It wasn't long before we hit signs of trouble. About a mile up, we found what looked like a small campsite, scattered granola bar wrappers, a disposable camera, and a dirty sweatshirt lying next to a patch of trampled ferns. But something was off about the setup. It didn't feel like kids were lounging around here. It felt more like someone had run through. The air was heavy, and I could smell this rank, earthy stench that was wrong for the forest. Matt raised an eyebrow at me, like he was feeling it too. We called out a few times, half expecting the teens to stumble out of the bushes, embarrassed and red-faced. But nothing stirred except a few startled birds. That eerie silence filled the gaps where sound should be. I knelt down, trying to get a sense of what had gone down here. There was a sharp imprint in the dirt, something like a claw mark, but wider and deeper than any animal I'd seen in these woods. I brushed my fingers over it, feeling the jagged lines. Whatever made that wasn't anything natural. You seeing this? Jeremy Harris had spotted something farther up, a chunk of what looked like torn fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It was a piece of a t-shirt, stained dark, likely blood. A chill settled over me then, the realization sinking in. Whatever was out here wasn't just a wild animal. We both knew when to trust our gut, and mine was screaming that we were in over our heads. We pressed on, calling their names, but now every rustle in the bushes had me glancing over my shoulder. About a mile deeper into the woods, we found the first body. It was one of the teens, a boy, face down with his arm twisted under him at an unnatural angle. His body was mangled in a way that no mountain lion or bear would have done. His torso was scratched open, not by claws but by something else, something that seemed to tear rather than slash. Matt stepped back, a grimace on his face, muttering something I didn't quite catch. We checked for signs of life, even though it was obvious we'd be wasting our time. He was gone. Worse yet, the terror etched onto his face told us this was no accident, no animal mishap. It was a hunt. We radioed back to the station, giving as calm a report as we could manage. They told us to stay put, that backup was on the way, but Matt and I exchanged a look. Sitting still in the woods with God knows what lurking around? Not likely. We agreed to find higher ground and keep watch until help arrived. But something told me that wouldn't be enough. Just as we started back toward a nearby ridge, we heard a faint sound, a low, uneven clicking, like stones scraping together. It was rhythmic and unnatural, like it had intent behind it. Matt raised his flashlight, sweeping it in a wide arc. I followed his beam, and for a moment we saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, between two thick pines, a shape appeared. It was unlike anything I'd seen, like a mix between a lizard and something much larger. It moved low to the ground with a long, scaly body and limbs that looked almost human in shape, though bent and twisted in a way no human could ever walk. Its skin was dark and rough, patched with what looked like scales. But the strangest part was its head. Elongated, with a wide, flat mouth and jagged rows of what I can only describe as crocodile-like teeth. Matt and I froze. The thing paused, raising its head as if it sensed us. Then, with a sharp hiss, it lunged forward. I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over, and I yanked Matt to the side just as it shot past us, swiping the air with a clawed arm. We bolted up the ridge, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste. But it was on us, relentless, snapping its jaws and thrashing through the underbrush with every step. I remember yelling at Matt to split off, hoping to confuse it, or at least buy us some time. He hesitated, but the look on my face must have convinced him, and he veered off to the left. I dove to the right, dodging trees and scrambling up a small incline. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, tearing at anything in its path. There was no mercy, no pause. It was like it had locked onto us, hungry and unyielding. I lost track of Matt in the chaos, my mind racing as I looked for any place to hide. I spotted a small crevice between two rocks and dove in, pressing myself flat against the earth, hoping it would lose my scent. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of Matt's scream, cutting through the forest. It was short, choked off, and I knew he'd met the same fate as the teenager back at the campsite. The clicking sound grew fainter, and I dared to lift my head. My legs were numb, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. But the forest around me was silent again. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, watching the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. When I was sure it was safe, I crawled out, my legs unsteady, and started the long trek back to the station, alone. When I returned to the ranger station, the backup was just arriving. They looked at me like I'd gone mad when I tried to explain what happened. They asked about Matt, and I told them the truth, as much as they would believe. We went back out to search, but we only found remnants, torn pieces of clothing, broken branches, drag marks leading deeper into the forest. No sign of Matt, no bodies. Nothing to prove what we'd seen, except my own word. Months later, I did some digging, trying to find any hint of what that creature was. Local legends spoke of a predator, something that roamed these woods centuries ago, rumored to be a guardian or a curse, depending on who you asked. They called it the El Cow, a name whispered by those who claimed to have seen it before vanishing into the wilderness. They said it only showed itself to those who dared to encroach on its territory, too far, too boldly, as if it needed to remind us that we were still trespassers here. That creature, it wasn't just hunting, it was sending a message, loud and clear.